I walked into the office that morning feeling absolutely unstoppable. My coffee was hot, perfectly balanced with just the right amount of cream. My suit was freshly pressed, the navy blue one I saved for important occasions. My mind felt sharp and focused after weeks of preparation. Today was the day I was finally going to close the deal that could change my entire career forever. The deal that would prove I belonged at the top level of this company, not stuck in middle management where I had been grinding for the past 4 years. "Morning, Colonel." My boss Depo greeted me, barely looking up from his phone as I passed his glass-walled office. His eyes stayed glued to the screen, scrolling through what looked like social media rather than anything work-related. I tried not to let his dismissiveness bother me. "Morning, sir. Big day today," I replied, trying to catch even a flicker of acknowledgement or encouragement. Something that showed he understood what this presentation meant, not just for me, but for our entire division. He finally glanced up, offering a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Big day, for you, I suppose," he said, his tone carrying an edge I couldn't quite identify. Was it jealousy? Resentment? Dismissiveness? I felt it already, the strange tension that always seemed to linger in his gaze whenever I achieved something noteworthy. But today, I genuinely didn't care about his attitude. I had spent 3 months cultivating this relationship with the client, preparing this pitch, running the numbers until they were perfect. This was my moment, and nothing Depo said or did was going to diminish it. The boardroom on the 15th floor smelled like expensive polished wood and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Lagos skyline, the morning sun streaming in and casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table. I faced the client, a high-stakes investor from New York named Marcus Chun, who represented a consortium with deep pockets and even deeper expectations. This meeting was to secure $17 million in funding for our company's expansion into West African markets. 17 million. The number still made my heart race every time I thought about it. "Colonel," Marcus said, standing to shake my hand firmly, his grip confident and assessing. "We've heard a lot about your work over the past few months. The research you sent was impressive. Very impressive. I trust you to lead this partnership." His words sent a surge of adrenaline through my system. This was validation from someone who had nothing to gain from flattering me, who dealt with billion-dollar portfolios and could spot incompetence from a mile away. My heart pounded with excitement and nervous energy as I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I had refined dozens of times. I was halfway through explaining our market penetration strategy, showing demographic data and projected returns, when the conference room door suddenly swung open. Depo barged in without knocking, his expression tight and determined. "Colonel, let me handle this from here," he snapped, cutting off my pitch mid-sentence about customer acquisition costs. The interruption was so abrupt and rude that I actually froze, my words dying in my throat. "I've prepared this entire presentation, Depo. I think the client wants to hear it from me," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice calm and professional despite the anger rising in my chest. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from interested to distinctly displeased. His eyes moved between Depo and me, clearly trying to understand the power dynamic playing out in front of him. "Honestly," Marcus said, his American accent cutting through the tension, "I came here specifically to meet with Colonel. We've been corresponding for months. Can we please continue with his presentation?" The question was polite but firm, leaving no room for interpretation. Depo's thin smile vanished completely, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that I recognized as barely suppressed rage. But he had no choice except to nod stiffly and take a seat in the corner, relegated to observer status in what should have been my moment alone. I continued the presentation with renewed confidence, feeding off Marcus's obvious engagement and the steady stream of intelligent questions he asked. We discussed market risks, mitigation strategies, competitive advantages, and long-term growth projections. By the time I reached the final slide, I could see approval in Marcus's eyes. This was going to close. I could feel it. By the end of the meeting, after 90 minutes of intense discussion and negotiation, the deal was officially ours. $17 million. The largest single investment our division had ever secured. My hands were actually shaking as I signed the final documents alongside Marcus, barely able to believe this was real. "Congratulations, Colonel," Marcus said warmly, shaking my hand again and this time placing his other hand on my shoulder in a gesture of genuine respect. "We'll be working with you directly going forward." I want you as the point person on this partnership. I felt invincible in that moment, like I had finally broken through to the level of success I had been chasing for years. I thanked Marcus professionally, walked him to the elevator, and returned to the office riding a wave of accomplishment and vindication. Until Depo called me into his office 30 minutes later and dropped a bomb that shattered everything. "Cunnel, sit down," Depo said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His voice was oddly calm, almost friendly, which immediately put me on guard. I sat, expecting praise or at least acknowledgement of what I had just accomplished. Instead, he steepled his fingers and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I've been thinking about our team structure," he began slowly, like he was choosing each word carefully. "And I've decided we need to restructure. Your role, your current position, will need to be adjusted. Demoted, actually." The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to process them. "You're joking," I said flatly, waiting for the punchline, for him to break into a smile and tell me this was some twisted test. He shook his head, and I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like satisfaction. "No joke, Cunnel. This is business. Nothing personal. The company needs to shift resources, and your position is being consolidated into a junior role. You'll report to someone else going forward. We'll discuss the details tomorrow." The casual cruelty of it, the timing, the utter injustice. It all hit me at once like a physical blow to the chest. I left the office that day in a state of shock, my earlier victory twisted into humiliation and confusion. I walked through the parking garage in a daze, got into my car, and just sat there for 20 minutes trying to process what had happened. How could he do this? I had just brought the company $17 million. I had earned this promotion I had been chasing. Instead, I was being demoted? The betrayal burned in my chest like acid. Finally, I drove home, barely registering the traffic or the familiar streets, my mind spinning with anger and disbelief. At home, I slammed the door behind me harder than I intended, the sound echoing through my small apartment. How could he? I muttered to myself, pacing back and forth across my living room, staring at the ceiling like answers might be written there. I brought him $17 million. I earned this. I did everything right. My girlfriend Amara came out of the bedroom, concern written across her face. She had been expecting me to come home celebrating, probably bringing champagne and talking about my inevitable promotion. Instead, she found me unraveling. "What happened?" she asked gently, guiding me to sit on the couch. I explained everything. The successful pitch, Marcus's praise, the promise of working together, and then Depo's incomprehensible decision to demote me hours after my biggest professional victory. "Maybe it's just a temporary setback," Amara tried to console me, rubbing my back soothingly. "Maybe there's some company politics you don't understand yet. Maybe it will work out." But I didn't feel comforted by her words. I felt betrayed, used, and furious. I had trusted Depo, had worked under him for years, and this was how he repaid my loyalty and success? That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed replaying every interaction with Depo over the past months, looking for signs I had missed, warnings I had ignored. And the more I thought about it, the more patterns emerged. The way he had taken credit for my work in team meetings. The way he had downplayed my contributions whenever senior leadership was around. The way he had tried to insert himself into my client relationship with Marcus despite having done none of the groundwork. It all pointed to one ugly truth. Depo saw me as a threat, and he was eliminating that threat the only way he knew how. The next morning, I started investigating quietly and methodically. If Depo was going to play dirty, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I began collecting evidence, saving every email, every meeting note, every document that showed my contributions to projects Depo had later claimed as his own. I reviewed approval chains and discovered that Depo had been systematically inserting his name into my work, forwarding my reports to senior leadership with minimal changes, but under his signature. Every conversation I had participated in, every successful pitch, every client win. He had found ways to position himself as the architect while reducing me to just another team member. I started taking screenshots, saving files to my personal cloud storage, documenting dates and times and witnesses. If this was going to become a battle, I needed ammunition. I also began reaching out carefully to colleagues I trusted, people who had worked with both me and Depo and might have their own stories to tell. A few whispered their frustrations about his management style over coffee in the cafeteria. Others were too scared to say anything, worried about their own job security. But I didn't need a crowd. I needed strategy and irrefutable evidence. One afternoon, I found myself alone with Depo in the elevator. The tension was thick enough to cut. I decided to confront him directly. No more playing nice. Depo, I said quietly as the elevator climbed toward our floor. Why are you really demoting me? He looked at me with that same thin smile, but his eyes were cold and calculating. You're ambitious, Colonel. Too ambitious. Threatening, actually. I couldn't let you outshine me in front of the senior leadership. It's that simple. The casual admission of his jealousy and insecurity stunned me into silence for a moment. Outshine you, I finally said, my voice harder than I intended. I closed $17 million for this company. I didn't outshine anyone. I delivered results. That's literally what we're supposed to do. He shrugged, completely unbothered by the moral implications of what he was doing. That's your perspective. Mine is different. You're young, talented, connected with clients, and the board likes you. That's dangerous for someone in my position. So I'm managing the situation. The elevator doors opened, and he walked out without another word, leaving me standing there processing his sociopathic honesty about sabotaging my career out of pure self-interest. I reached out to a colleague named Folake who worked in a different division but had her ear to the ground regarding office politics. Over lunch at a quiet restaurant far from our office, she confirmed what I had suspected. Everyone knows what Depo's doing, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. He's done it before. There was a guy named Tun 3 years ago who brought in a huge client, and Depo pushed him out within 6 months. The higher-ups know, but Depo is good at managing up. He makes himself indispensable to the people who matter. So what do? I asked, feeling a bit helpless despite my anger. Folake leaned forward, her expression serious. You need to make yourself indispensable directly to the people who matter. Not through Depo. Around him. The board, the client, anyone who has power independent of him. Document everything, build your own relationships, and make it impossible for him to erase you. Her words gave me the framework I needed. This wasn't going to be a quick fight. It was going to be strategic, patient, and absolutely ruthless in its precision. The next scheduled call with Marcus and his team became my first opportunity to implement Folake's advice. Instead of going through Depo as protocol suggested, I sent Marcus a direct email proposing we discuss the next phase of implementation. Marcus responded within an hour, enthusiastically agreeing and suggesting we include his entire investment committee. When Depo found out I had scheduled the call without his involvement, he was furious. You go through me for client communications, he hissed at me in the hallway. That's the chain of command. I looked at him calmly and said, Marcus specifically requested I lead this partnership. I'm just following the client's wishes. The call went brilliantly. Marcus's team asked detailed questions about timeline, resource allocation, risk management, and market entry strategy. I answered every question confidently, demonstrating the depth of preparation and expertise that had won the deal in the first place. At the end of the call, Marcus made a comment that I knew would infuriate Depo. Colonel, I have to say, working directly with you has been refreshing. You understand our concerns and respond quickly. Please continue being our primary point of contact. We trust your judgment. I thanked him professionally while internally celebrating this small but significant victory. Depo noticed the shift immediately. Suddenly, I was communicating directly with our biggest new client, receiving praise and building a relationship that bypassed him entirely. He started micromanaging my work, demanding to see every email before I sent it, requiring approval for every document, inserting himself into every conversation. I complied with his demands while documenting every instance of his interference. I remained professional in every interaction, smiled in meetings, never gave him ammunition to claim I was insubordinate or difficult. My revenge wouldn't be loud or emotional. It would be surgical, systematic, and utterly devastating. I also started presenting regular updates to the executive leadership team, framing them as routine project status reports, but ensuring my name and contributions were visible at the highest levels of the company. I volunteered for presentations, authored white papers that got circulated widely, and made sure that every success was documented with my signature clearly attached. Depo watched this with growing frustration, sending increasingly passive-aggressive emails questioning my time management and suggesting I was overstepping my current role. I ignored his provocations, maintaining perfect professionalism while letting his frustration become more and more visible to others. The tension between us became obvious to everyone in the office. Colleagues started noticing how Depo would interrupt me in meetings, dismiss my suggestions, or take credit for ideas I had proposed. Some people approached me privately to offer support or share their own stories of similar treatment. I thanked them but kept my strategy close. I didn't want word getting back to Depo that I was building a case against him. The element of surprise would be crucial. I needed him to think he was winning right up until the moment everything collapsed on him. One Friday afternoon, about 6 weeks after my demotion, Depo finally snapped. We were in a team meeting when I presented an analysis that Marcus's team had specifically requested. Depo interrupted me halfway through, his voice rising with anger. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you, Cunnel?" he shouted in front of half the office, his professional mask finally cracking completely. "You think because one client likes you, you can do whatever you want. Let me remind you, you're nothing without me. I made your career. Everything you have, I gave you." The room went completely silent. Everyone stared at Depo, shocked by the outburst. I met his eyes calmly, keeping my voice level and steady. "That's an interesting perspective, Depo. But I think you have it backwards. I think you're nothing without the people you claim to lead. The deals I close, the relationships I build, the work I produce, that's mine, not yours." My words were quiet, but they cut through the room like a knife. Depo's face turned red, his jaw clenching with rage. He stormed out of the meeting, leaving the rest of us sitting in uncomfortable silence. I calmly finished my presentation as if nothing had happened. That weekend, I spent both days compiling my evidence into a comprehensive presentation. Every deal I had closed with documentation showing my role. Every email chain showing Depo taking credit for my work. Every instance of him inserting himself into my client relationships after I had done the groundwork. Every claim he had made to senior leadership about projects he had barely participated in. I organized it chronologically, with clear headers and supporting documents. The picture it painted was damning, a pattern of systematic credit theft and career sabotage spanning multiple years and multiple team members. Monday morning, I arrived at the office early and sent a formal request to the board of directors for an emergency meeting. My email was brief and professional. "I need to present information regarding serious management concerns that affect the company's client relationships and team morale. This cannot wait for the regular quarterly review. Please advise on your availability." Within 3 hours, I had a meeting scheduled for Wednesday morning. The board's quick response told me they had been hearing whispers about Depo for a while and were ready to hear the full story. Tuesday dragged by with excruciating slowness. Depo was in meetings most of the day, thankfully, so I didn't have to interact with him much. I used the time to rehearse my presentation, anticipating questions, strengthening weak points in my argument, and making sure every claim I planned to make was backed by concrete evidence. Amara helped me practice that evening, playing devil's advocate and challenging my assertions. "What if they say you're just bitter about the demotion?" she asked. I showed her the pattern of behavior that predated my demotion by years. "What if they ask why you didn't come forward sooner?" I explained that I hadn't understood the full scope until I started investigating. Wednesday morning arrived. I wore my best suit, the charcoal gray one that made me look older and more authoritative. I arrived at the boardroom 15 minutes early, set up my laptop, and waited. The board members filed in, 5 senior executives who controlled the company's strategic direction. Depo arrived last, looking confused about why he had been summoned to an emergency meeting. When he saw me standing at the head of the table with my presentation loaded, his face went pale. He knew. In that moment, he understood exactly what was about to happen, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Thank you all for making time on short notice." I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I've brought information about systematic management failures that have affected team morale, client relationships, and company integrity. What I'm about to show you represents a pattern of behavior spanning several years." I clicked to the first slide, which showed a simple timeline. Then I began walking them through everything. Every stolen deal, every falsified contribution claim, every example of Depo taking credit for work his team members had produced. The board members' expressions shifted from curiosity to concern to outright anger as I progressed through the presentation. I showed them emails where Depo had forwarded my work to senior leadership with minimal changes, but his name attached. I showed them meeting notes where he had claimed credit for strategies I had developed. I showed them the $17 million deal documentation, with my name on every planning document, every client email, every negotiation note, and then showed them how Depo had presented it to the CEO as a team effort he had supervised, minimizing my role to that of a junior associate who had helped with research. And the $17 million Marcus Chun partnership? I asked, looking directly at Depo, whose name is actually on the client contract as the primary relationship manager. I clicked to the next slide, showing the signed agreement with my name clearly listed as the lead contact. Marcus had insisted on it, I explained, because he wanted to work with the person who had actually built the relationship with him, not someone who appeared at the last minute trying to take control. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Then I showed them the demotion letter Depo had given me, dated just hours after I had closed the biggest deal our division had ever seen. I was told this was about restructuring and resource allocation, I said quietly. But the timing suggests otherwise. It suggests retaliation against someone who was becoming too visible, too successful, too much of a threat to an insecure manager. I let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing with examples of similar treatment other team members had experienced under Depo's leadership. Several people I had interviewed had been willing to provide statements once they knew I was formally reporting the behavior. By the time I reached my final slide, a summary of recommendations that included formal investigation and leadership changes, the board members were exchanging meaningful looks. Depo sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through denial, anger, and finally resignation. He tried to argue once, stammering that I was mischaracterizing his management style, that I was bitter about the demotion, that this was all being taken out of context. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented. Every claim I made was backed by multiple sources. There was no room for interpretation or alternative explanations. The board excused both of us from the room while they deliberated. Depo and I stood in the hallway, not speaking, carefully maintaining distance from each other. I could see him mentally calculating his options, trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage the situation. After 20 agonizing minutes, we were called back in. The board chair, a stern woman named Mrs. Adelik, delivered their decision with the kind of clinical precision that comes from years of corporate leadership experience. After reviewing the evidence presented by Cunnell, the board has decided on immediate action, she stated, looking directly at Depo. Your management of this division has demonstrated patterns of behavior inconsistent with our company values and damaging to both team morale and client relationships. Effective immediately, you are being reassigned to a non-management advisory role pending a full HR investigation. Cunnell, your demotion is rescinded. You are restored to your previous position with an immediate promotion to senior director, reporting directly to the executive committee. You will take over leadership of the division. Walking out of that boardroom, I felt a wave of vindication wash over me that was almost overwhelming. It wasn't just about the promotion, though that was significant. It was about every time Depo had belittled me, every instance of stolen credit, every moment of calculated betrayal being finally, publicly acknowledged and punished. Justice had been served, and it tasted better than I had imagined. Depo left the building that afternoon, and I never saw him in the office again. He was gone, his career in ruins, his reputation destroyed by his own actions finally catching up with him. That evening, Marcus called to congratulate me on the promotion. Word had apparently traveled fast. Cunnell, he said, raising what I imagined was a glass of wine on his end of the call. You earned this. Not just the deal, not just the promotion, you earned respect. The hard way. That means something in this business. A lot of people would have just quit and moved on. You stayed and fought for what was right. That's the kind of integrity we want to partner with. His words meant more to me than any financial bonus could have. I had proven something important. That talent and integrity could win even against entrenched power and corruption. Sitting in my apartment that night, I replayed the past 2 months in my mind. The heartbreak of being demoted after my greatest success. The betrayal of realizing someone I had trusted was actively sabotaging my career. The grinding work of collecting evidence and building a case. But also the resilience I had discovered in myself, the courage to confront injustice head-on, and the satisfaction of seeing justice prevail. Amara squeezed my hand, proud and relieved that the nightmare was finally over. You did it, she said simply. And I had. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of transition. I moved into Depo's old office, a corner space with windows overlooking the city that I had envied for years. I assembled a new leadership team, promoting people who had been held back by Depo's insecurity and bringing in fresh talent from outside. The atmosphere in the division changed almost overnight. People smiled more, contributed ideas more freely, took initiative without fear of having their work stolen. Several team members approached me privately to thank me for what I had done, sharing their own stories of how Depo's management had nearly driven them to quit. I also made a point of reaching out to former team members who had left the company during Depo's tenure, people like Tund who Folake had mentioned. I wanted to understand the full pattern of his behavior and make sure it could never happen again. What I learned was disturbing. Depo had created a toxic environment for years, crushing anyone who threatened to surpass him, taking credit systematically, and driving away some of the company's best talent. The board had known something was wrong, but hadn't had concrete evidence until I provided it. My courage to speak up had apparently opened floodgates of complaints from others. I implemented new policies designed to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. Transparent credit attribution on all projects, with team members' names clearly attached to their contributions. Regular 360-degree feedback reviews where teams could anonymously report management problems. Direct lines of communication to HR for complaints about leadership behavior. And I made it clear in every team meeting that taking credit for others' work was grounds for immediate termination, regardless of position or seniority. The culture needed to change fundamentally, and I was determined to lead that change. Marcus flew in from New York for our first major project milestone meeting. We spent 2 days working through implementation details, and he seemed genuinely impressed by the progress we had made. This partnership is exceeding our expectations, he told me over dinner on the second evening. And honestly, Colonel, that's because of you. Your leadership, your vision, your attention to detail. We made the right choice insisting on working with you directly. Depo would have been a disaster. His candid assessment validated everything I had fought for. The project itself was thriving. We had already secured 2 additional clients through Marcus's network, bringing in another $12 million in funding. The success was snowballing in exactly the way I had projected during my original pitch. The board took notice, mentioning in quarterly reviews how the division's performance had improved dramatically since my promotion. I tried not to be smug about it, but internally I felt vindicated. This was what success looked like when it wasn't being sabotaged by an insecure manager who saw talent as a threat rather than an asset. I learned valuable lessons through the whole ordeal that shaped how I approach leadership going forward. Talent alone isn't enough. You need strategy, you need allies, you need documentation, and you need the courage to confront injustice head-on even when it's risky. You can't just be good at your job. You have to protect your contributions, build your own relationships, and never rely entirely on someone else to advocate for you. These were hard lessons, learned through betrayal and pain, but they made me a stronger and more effective leader than I would have been otherwise. Depo tried to reach out one last time, about 3 months after his removal. I was leaving the office late when I saw him waiting by my car in the parking garage. My first instinct was alarm, but he looked defeated rather than threatening. "Colonel," he said, his voice lacking all the arrogance I remembered. "Can we talk for a minute?" I considered refusing, but curiosity won out. I nodded, keeping my distance and my hand near my phone. "I should have handled you differently," he muttered, not quite able to meet my eyes. I was wrong. I see that now. I looked at him for a long moment, processing his words. Was this genuine regret? Or just bitterness at being caught? "You were wrong about a lot of things, Depo," I said finally. Wrong about thinking you could steal credit indefinitely. Wrong about believing I wouldn't fight back. Wrong about what leadership actually means. But mostly, you were wrong about me. You thought I was just another ambitious kid you could crush. You underestimated me. He had no response to that. He just stood there looking small and defeated, a shell of the arrogant manager who had tried to destroy my career. "I already handled this situation," I continued, my voice harder now. "And I handled it better than you ever could have. You could have been a real leader. You could have mentored me, championed me, helped me grow. We could have built something great together. Instead, you chose insecurity and sabotage. That was your decision, and these are your consequences. I don't feel bad about it." He nodded slowly, understanding that no amount of apology was going to change what had happened or restore what he had lost. Then he walked away, and I never saw or heard from him again. Weeks turned into months, and the project we had built continued to exceed expectations. The initial $17 million investment had grown into a $40 million portfolio as Marcus's network connected us with additional investors who were impressed by our results. The division I now led became the fastest growing in the company, contributing more than a third of our total revenue. The board gave me increasing autonomy and resources, trusting my judgment in ways they had never trusted Depo. I hired aggressively, building a team of talented people who shared my values of integrity and collaboration. I also made a point of mentoring young professionals in the company who reminded me of myself, ambitious, talented, but vulnerable to being exploited by insecure managers. I would pull them aside after meetings and share my story, explaining how to document their work, build their own relationships, and protect their contributions. Never rely entirely on your manager to advocate for you, I would tell them. Build your own reputation. Create your own relationships with clients and senior leadership. Be so good that you become indispensable on your own merits, not because someone else says you're valuable. The office culture improved dramatically under my leadership. People stayed later not because they were forced to but because they were engaged and excited about their work. Collaboration increased because people weren't afraid of having their ideas stolen. Innovation flourished because team members felt safe proposing ambitious projects without fear of being undermined. Exit interviews showed a dramatic decrease in departures, and recruitment became easier as word spread that our division was a great place to work. Everything Depo had suppressed through his toxic leadership was now flourishing in his absence. One afternoon, about a year after taking over the division, I received an unexpected email from Tund, the team member Folake had mentioned who had been pushed out by Depo years earlier. He had heard about what happened and wanted to thank me. I left the company convinced I wasn't good enough, he wrote. Depo had beaten down my confidence so thoroughly that I questioned whether I belonged in this industry at all. Hearing that it wasn't about my ability, that it was about his insecurity all along, it healed something in me that I didn't realize was still broken. Thank you for exposing him. Thank you for making sure he couldn't keep doing this to others. His email hit me harder than I expected. I had been focused on my own justice, my own vindication, my own career. But my actions had ripple effects I hadn't fully considered. Other people who had been hurt by Depo were healing from the knowledge that it wasn't their fault, that they hadn't failed, they had been sabotaged. I wrote back to Tund, thanking him for reaching out and asking if he'd be interested in coming back to the company. Within a month, I had hired him into a senior position on my team. He proved to be exactly as talented as I had heard, thriving under leadership that supported rather than suppressed his abilities. The anniversary of closing the $17 million deal arrived. The company threw a celebration, recognizing it as a pivotal moment in our growth. I stood in front of the entire staff and told the story, carefully edited to avoid making it entirely about Depo's betrayal, but honest about the challenges I had faced. Success isn't just about being good at your job, I told them. It's about having the courage to stand up when you're treated unfairly. It's about documenting your contributions and fighting for recognition when it's denied. And it's about building a culture where everyone's work is valued and credited appropriately. That's what we've built here over the past year. That's what I'm most proud of. Marcus attended the anniversary celebration, flying in specifically for the event. He pulled me aside during the reception and handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from his investment group, offering me a position as a partner if I ever wanted to leave corporate life and join their firm. You've proven yourself 100 times over, he said. This offer is completely serious. No pressure to accept, but I want you to know the door is open whenever you're ready. I was stunned and flattered. A year ago, I had been facing an unjust demotion. Now, I was being courted by one of the most prestigious investment firms in New York. I didn't accept his offer immediately. I loved the work I was doing, loved the team I was building, loved the culture we were creating. But having the offer validated something important. My value in the market wasn't dependent on any single manager's opinion of me. I was good enough, skilled enough, connected enough to succeed anywhere. That knowledge was empowering in ways that went beyond career options. It was psychological armor against ever feeling powerless again. No matter what happened in the future, I knew I could land on my feet. The board promoted me again 6 months later, making me one of the youngest vice presidents in the company's history. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, stock options, and a seat on the executive leadership team. During the announcement, the CEO specifically mentioned my integrity and courage in addressing management problems, setting a standard he wanted all leaders in the company to follow. I thought about Depo hearing that announcement from whatever job he had found after leaving. I hoped it stung. Not because I was vindictive, but because consequences should sting. That's how people learn. I started getting invited to speak at industry conferences about leadership and ethics. My story, appropriately anonymized, became a case study in business schools about navigating toxic work environments and advocating for yourself. Young professionals would approach me after presentations to share their own stories of being undermined or exploited, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing. Document everything, build your own relationships. Never let someone else be the sole gatekeeper to your success, and have the courage to speak up when you're treated unjustly. It's risky, I would admit, but it's riskier to stay silent and let someone destroy your career piece by piece. Amara and I got married 2 years after the Depo incident. At our wedding, surrounded by colleagues who had become friends and family who had supported me through the wedding reception became an unexpected networking event. Marcus flew in from New York with his wife, and several other clients made the trip to Lagos to celebrate with us. My team showed up in force, turning one corner of the venue into what looked like an office party. Even Mrs. Adelik from the board attended, which surprised me. "You've changed this company," she told me during the father-daughter dance that my dad and I shared. "Not just your division, the whole culture. People feel safer speaking up now. That's your legacy, Colonel." Her words meant more than any bonus or promotion ever could. But the most meaningful moment came when Tund stood up during the toasts. He hadn't planned to speak, but something moved him. "I left this company 3 years ago believing I had failed," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "I thought I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't whatever enough." Then Colonel did something brave. He stood up to the person who had made me feel that way. And in doing so, he gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, my confidence. "Colonel, you didn't just save your own career. You saved mine too. Thank you." The room erupted in applause, and I had to wipe my eyes before standing to embrace him. That night, lying in bed in our hotel room before flying out for our honeymoon, Amara turned to me. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd just accepted the demotion? If you'd stayed quiet?" I considered the question seriously. "Every day," I admitted. "I think about how I almost did stay quiet. How close I came to just taking it and moving on. But then I think about Tund and everyone else Depo hurt. I think about the culture that's changed. And I realize that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're scared." 3 years into my role as VP, the company faced its biggest challenge yet. The global economy contracted sharply, and investors started pulling back from emerging markets. Several of our competitors went under, unable to sustain their growth projections. Our board called an emergency meeting, and the atmosphere was tense. "We need to cut costs," the CFO announced, pulling up spreadsheets that painted a grim picture. "Every division needs to reduce headcount by at least 20%. No exceptions." The room went silent as the implications sank in. I looked at those spreadsheets differently than my fellow executives. I saw names behind every number, families depending on those salaries, careers that would be derailed. "What if we don't cut people?" I asked. The CFO looked at me like I was insane. "Then we cut salaries across the board, starting with leadership. We reduce bonuses. We freeze hiring. We renegotiate office leases. We find every possible expense to trim before we destroy people's livelihoods." The room erupted in arguments, some executives calling my proposal naive, others intrigued but skeptical. I spent the next week building a comprehensive alternative plan. I worked with HR to model different scenarios, showing how salary reductions at the executive level could preserve jobs at lower levels. I identified wasteful spending, expensive consultants who produced minimal value, redundant software licenses, lavish client entertainment that could be scaled back. By the time I presented my revised plan to the board, I had found a way to cut 30% of costs without eliminating a single position. "It requires sacrifice from those of us who can afford it," I acknowledged. "But it's the right thing to do." The board approved my plan, though not without resistance from executives who didn't want to see their own compensation reduced. But Mrs. Adelik backed me strongly, and her support carried weight. "Colonel has proven his judgment repeatedly," she said firmly. If he says this will work, I believe him. And frankly, if we can't make temporary sacrifices to protect our people, we don't deserve to lead them. The plan was implemented immediately. I took the largest salary cut of any executive, 15% of my base pay. To set an example, the response from the team was overwhelming. People who had been bracing for termination instead received emails explaining the temporary belt-tightening measures, but guaranteeing job security. Morale, which could have collapsed, actually strengthened. People worked harder, knowing their leadership had fought for them. Productivity increased despite the resource constraints. And when the economy began recovering 18 months later, we were positioned better than competitors who had gutted their workforce and now struggled to rebuild. Marcus called during this period to check in. "I heard what you did," he said. "Protecting your team instead of taking the easy route. That's rare, Colonel. Most executives would have just cut headcount and preserved their own compensation. You did the opposite." I explained my reasoning. That talent was our most valuable asset, that rebuilding a strong team after layoffs would cost more than temporary salary reductions, and that it was simply the right thing to do. "Well," Marcus said thoughtfully, "my offer still stands. But I'm starting to think you're exactly where you need to be." 5 years after the Depo incident, I received an unexpected LinkedIn message. It was from Depo himself. I stared at the notification for several minutes before opening it. "Colonel," the message read, "I know I have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I've spent these years working on myself. Therapy, self-reflection, understanding why I did what I did. I was broken in ways I didn't recognize. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to say that watching your career from a distance, seeing the leader you've become, taught me more about real leadership than I learned in my entire previous career. You were right about everything. Thank you for that lesson, even though I fought against learning it." I showed the message to Amara. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I thought about it for a long time. The old hurt had faded, but not disappeared entirely. But I also recognized growth when I saw it. "I'm going to acknowledge it," I finally decided. I wrote back, "Depo, I appreciate you reaching out. Real change requires courage, and it sounds like you've been doing difficult work. I wish you well." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was grace. And grace, I had learned, was something leaders needed to practice. That same week, I stood in front of our entire division for our annual review. We had exceeded every target, secured 3 major new partnerships, and become the most profitable unit in the company. But I didn't start my speech by talking about numbers. 5 years ago, I learned that success isn't just about deals closed or revenue generated. It's about integrity. It's about fighting for what's right even when it's risky. It's about building a culture where everyone's contribution is valued and protected. Every single person in this room has contributed to what we've built. Every single person deserves credit for our success. And that's how we'll continue to operate, together with transparency, with integrity, with courage. The applause was long and genuine. As I looked out at the faces of my team, people I had hired, people I had mentored, people who had taken the lessons I learned the hard way and built their own successful careers, I felt something profound. Not just success, but purpose. I had taken a betrayal and transformed it into a movement. I had taken injustice and turned it into a catalyst for cultural change. Depo had tried to destroy my career, but instead he had given me the opportunity to discover what I was truly capable of. And for that, strangely, I was almost grateful. Almost. As I walked back to my office after the meeting, passing through hallways filled with people who trusted me, worked hard because they felt valued, and knew their contributions would never be stolen or diminished, I realized something important. The $17 million deal had changed my career. But fighting for justice, protecting my team, and building a culture of integrity, that had defined my legacy. And that was worth infinitely more than any single deal could ever be.